Hello.
Hello.
Hello. I have gone back to university for a follow-up certificate, and this is a video I made for one of my classes. I liked how it turned out, wanted to share it. This video is about how to teach your kids about any sex-related topic, whether that's reproduction, anatomy, intersex anatomy, gender identity, sexual orientation, all of that kind of stuff. What it is not is an explainer of each of those topics individually. So I want this to be a video that is friendly toward parents who haven't necessarily looked into these topics in great depth before, who might not know the 101 on transgender stuff, but it's not going to actually lay that stuff out. It will give a framework for how to talk about it once you have done the research, and I want it to be a place that is safe and friendly for everybody to watch this video. So I want, for example, trans people to be able to watch this video and feel that I've been treating them respectfully, and I want intersex people to feel like that. So let me know in the comments if there's something that I can do better in future, but if there's just like a cool thing or a key piece of information that you feel I've left out, it's very probable that I did it on purpose, but still feel free to leave it down there so that other people who are looking for what they can research next can have an idea of what to look out for. Thanks for being here. On with the show. So, things are hard out here right now for a group of people that I love, and that means things are hard for me. I've been wanting for years now to make a video about transgender people and how glad I am to live in a world with transgender people, and the stakes always feel so high, astronomically high, and not getting better anytime soon. So part of me is like, I just want to say some nice things about trans people. And another part of me is going, that's not good enough. So we're going to do a combination approach. I'm going to talk about gender and sexuality, and I'm also going to combine it with another one of my interests, which is that I am a mother. Here is a photo of me and my 3 children. Yes, they are beautiful. And as a parent, one of the hot takes that really bothers me is when people say, how am I going to explain this to my child? First of all, kids are smart. At least mine are. Secondly, our kids live on Earth. No matter what your beliefs are, people are different from you. When people make fun of the whole how do I explain this to my child thing, the image that they're evoking is like a white suburban mom who is losing her mind because there's a cartoon with 2 teddy bears that have bow ties and they're holding hands. To some extent, when people parody this, it's about the sense of entitlement, like other people's lives need to make sense to me. So first off, they don't. We need to be able to step back for a second and say, I don't know what's going on there. And that's okay. But underneath that, there is a very real insecurity. It's awful not to know how to talk to your kids about something, especially when you can tell that it's important. So let's talk about what we want as parents. Now, this is just one survey. It doesn't stand for the feelings of everybody who ever had a kid, but I do think that it matches my lived experience of talking to other parents out here in the world. According to this, more than half of the parents that participated in this survey believe that sexual education should primarily be done in the home, and any curriculum that happens at school needs to just lend support to what the parents are already doing. More than half. Pretty popular idea. It's my job to teach my kids this, and anything else you do is extra. However, 60% of these same parents said that they had never actually had the talk with their kid. And another overlapping 50% stated that they probably needed to learn more about sex ed themselves before they would feel comfortable teaching it to their kids. In other words, there seems to be a disparity between what we as parents want to provide and what we feel able to provide. We legitimately want to have this conversation with our kids. At least most of us do. For that matter, I don't think that this survey covered people who don't want to teach their kids about sex and don't want school to do it either. But that's gotta be some people, right? So that leads me to some other productive questions we can ask. What should we be teaching? And then, how should we teach it? So starting with that first one, there are a lot of different approaches you can imagine when it comes to teaching kids about sexuality and sex, reproduction, gender identity, all that kind of stuff. Surely some of those approaches are good, and some of them are not good. Luckily, there's been a lot of research about this. Now, from what I could gather, most of the research has been about sex ed curriculum in schools, but I don't see why we as parents can't learn from what the schools are doing. One of the cool resources that I found is this paper that is not only a study, but a study of studies. It's a review of 80 different studies over the last 3 decades, looking into different ways of teaching a sex ed curriculum in school. And what this study of studies found is that what they call a comprehensive sex education is the most strongly correlated with positive outcomes for children. Positive outcomes of a comprehensive sex education include appreciation of sexual diversity, dating and intimate partner violence prevention, development of healthy relationships, prevention of child sex abuse, improved social and emotional learning, and increased media literacy. So what does a comprehensive approach entail? Well, according to this review, it means starting early, it means supporting the information in other classes, it means spending enough time on the topic to really cover it well, and it means including LGBTQ+ topics and social justice topics. Now, some of that might be off the table for what certain parents want to teach to their kids, but think about it this way. Your kid is going to have friends who are LGBT. They are going to have friends whose parents are LGBT. Your kid might be LGBT. So if you and your kid can both approach this from a place of understanding instead of a place of confusion and anxiety, you're both going to be better off. Some parents have questions about whether just telling your kid about a practice makes them more likely to do it. And fortunately, we have some information about that in front of us. A study of so-called abstinence-only programs in high schools found that using a curriculum primarily emphasizing the importance of premarital abstinence seems to make no statistically significant difference in outcomes such as teen pregnancy, getting STDs, using birth control, even whether or not to have sex in the first place. Let me say that again. A curriculum that tells you not to have sex does not stop you from having sex. What does apparently improve these outcomes is the approach that I mentioned before, the comprehensive one. Now, I said so-called abstinence-only programs because these programs do include stuff other than abstinence. They include STDs, and they include how reproduction works, anatomy of both sexes, interpersonal relationship safety, the ability to make your own choices. Good stuff. It's great. But they do lean very heavily on the abstinence angle, and they don't succeed at that goal. To me, that's what it really comes down to. It doesn't accomplish what it's trying to accomplish, and the outcomes are not as good as the ones in this review of 80 studies over the last 30 years. As for how this applies to parents teaching in the home, that first survey that I talked about, the one about attitudes towards school sex ed curriculums, well, it also included a part where they actually quizzed the parents on their own knowledge of sex ed type information. And they compared that section with another section where parents self-reported how comfortable they were, how open of an attitude they had toward different kinds of identities and lifestyles and practices. And what they found was the more open-minded a parent was, the more comfortable they were with the diversity of ways to be a person in this world, the more correct answers they got on the pop quiz part. So if our question is, how do I explain this to my kids? Our first answer to that question has to be, teach yourself first. If you're watching this, you have the internet, you probably have a library. You can go onto a search engine and type Trans 101 or Things Not to Say to a Gay Man or Lesbian How We Met stories. You can look up the history of the LGBT rights movement. You can look this stuff up without completely buying into it. Your first step here is just to get information. Your second step is to look at anything that makes you uncomfortable and figure out why. You might have a good reason. You might have a bad reason. You're entitled to feel however you feel about it. You're entitled to talk to a therapist and try to feel better about it. You're entitled to not do that. But I think you do have a responsibility to have this information in your mind. Now, the library thing might give you a little bit of trouble. I went to my little small town podunk library, and I scoured the parenting section for sex books, and I scoured the sex section for parenting books, and this is all I got, and a lot of it is real bad. First of all, there's just a fundamental systemic problem with how this information is organized. Under the Dewey Decimal System that libraries use, straight people's sexuality is in the science section. Anatomy, reproduction, all of that stuff is in the 600 range. Queer sexuality is in the 300 range. Over in social science, probably a different shelf, maybe even a different room if you live in a bigger city than I do. Out of sight, out of mind. I myself had to go to the library twice because I realized when I got home that I had forgotten to check the 300 section, and there they were. So this little pile I've got here is the parenting books that have sexuality in them and the sexuality books that have parenting in them. I also found one teenage book about transgender teens, which is very cool. And I found exactly one children's book about reproduction. I assume they have more. Maybe they have dozens and they're all checked out right now. But I just thought as an exercise it would be interesting to see what was there for somebody just kind of digging around in the stacks. One of these books didn't end up being relevant. It was Gay Like Me, which is more of a memoir. So out of these books that I brought home that are even one page about parents teaching your children about sexuality, 3 out of 5 of them are specifically intended for evangelical Christian parents. That is not to say that these books should be banned from the library. I wouldn't ban a book from the library if it was a hit piece on me personally. What I am saying is that's a high percentage of books that are not going to correspond to what we've already learned the experts say is the safest and most effective way to teach about these topics. One of them I want to single out for being particularly atrocious. It's this Focus on the Family book, and it is garbage. It's garbage. This book gets exactly 1 point for me for alluding to the fact that maybe it would be appropriate for boys to learn about menstrual cycles. Good job. Negative 5,000 points for having a list of reasons to wait to have sex that include things like damaged goods and the moral high ground. There's also a section called, what if your adolescent isn't sure of his or her sexual orientation? It doesn't say, what if your kid is gay? It says, what if your kid thinks they're gay? Because the number one thing that you need to understand from this book is,
no, they're not.
And minus another 10,000 points for implying that if your child still thinks they're gay when they grow up, maybe you should not invite your adult offspring's homosexual lover to Thanksgiving dinner. Trash. Gay people aren't dangerous. Stop this. Now, one of the books that I did like is this one, How to Talk So Teens Will Listen and Listen So Teens Will Talk, which is part of a series, and they've been around for a long time, but I was really pleasantly surprised. It has a lot of good stuff that I'm going to get to in a little bit when I finally get around to answering my own question here. All of this to say, when you go on your fact-finding quest, be careful about what sources you use, and I say that knowing that it applies to the ones I like too. And remember that one of the benefits of a comprehensive sex education, according to all those studies, was increased media literacy. It's good for all of us. Now, believe it or not, there actually is one thing that every single source I found agreed about, which is wild when you consider how controversial all of this is. All of these sources said, yes, you should have this conversation. You should have it frankly, openly, and honestly. You should be respectful of your kid, and respectful of the process, use medically appropriate terms, and you should talk to them about it more than once. That was one of the things that this book does particularly well. It has little comics and little storytelling bits about how you can easily and casually work in conversations about sex, gender, relationships, with just stuff that comes up every day. You can say things like, what did you think about the way that song talked about girls? And you gotta answer your kids' questions when they ask them. Kids will ask you, especially when they're young, and you gotta get it in there then, so that when they stop feeling like asking you that stuff, they'll have the information. Okay, so, how? You know the information yourself? You're prepared to have a forthright, casual, well-informed, loving conversation. No tall order. And what are you gonna say? Well, here are a couple of things that I have learned from experience. Number 1. Start when your kids are young. Talk about private body parts at the same time as you talk about other body parts. You're giving your kid a bath, say, now we're cleaning your hand, now we're cleaning your elbow, now we're cleaning your shoulder, now we're cleaning your tummy, now we're cleaning your scrotum, now we're cleaning your knee. Your kid needs to be used to hearing it, you need to be used to saying it, and your kid needs to know what it's called in case they need to come and tell you an awful story about something that happened to them at school. These are things you have to think about as a parent. Another really good way to do this is to use anatomy toys, like puzzles or magnet sets that you can find online. When my oldest was a toddler, we got this pair of wooden puzzles that have stacked layers. One has typical boy anatomy, the other has typical girl anatomy. There's a skeleton layer, an organ layer, a muscle layer, a skin layer, and a clothing layer. And this makes it extraordinarily easy to bring up any number of topics while you play with the puzzles. We would review the names of the sex organs along with the other body parts, and we would expand it beyond just that. I would talk about how the two puzzles were almost identical, except for the groin area and the clothing. And we talked about how some people wear different kinds of clothes than what these dolls are wearing. We talked about how people have different skin colors than the ones that are shown here, different hairstyles, different shapes to their body, different sizes of their body. We talked about how some people don't have 2 arms, some people don't have 2 legs or 2 eyes or 2 kidneys, some people don't have a uterus. Some people have parts of both kinds of sex organs. And these were fun conversations. They were breezy, they were simple for me to have, and they prepared my kids for all kinds of body differences so that the first time they ever thought of the concept of somebody not having a nose, it wasn't at the grocery store in front of a guy without a nose. Mommy, why doesn't that guy have a nose? It laid the foundation for future conversations about sex and gender. And I'll interject here. If your kid does ask you about stuff in the grocery store, it is rough, and You should sit down and write yourself a script for what you're going to do in that situation, because you will not be able to think. My script is something like, if your kid says, "Mom, is that a boy or a girl?" you can say something like, "That's a person buying their groceries just like us." And then talk about it more later when the other person doesn't have to listen to you do it. That kind of thing is great because it works for all kinds of situations. It also works for, why is that person in a wheelchair? And why is that lady smoking? Doesn't she know it's bad for you? Trust me, it will happen. Prepare. Also, a quick shout out to these two books. It's So Amazing and It's Not the Stork. I especially like this one, It's Not the Stork. They're just really good, really thorough, healthy, cheerful books about bodies, and they make passing references to same-sex relationships. And honestly, I could do with more, but it's easy for me to add more, especially when I have the jumping off point of it actually being in the book. I can take a second and explicate to my heart's content. They're not perfect. They do contain the incorrect statement that all boys have XY chromosomes and all girls have XX chromosomes, which turns out not to be true. But knowing that, again, I can just add it in however much feels appropriate to the time and place. Or I could just drop in saying, this is usually true, it's not always true, and we can come back to it later. Now, my second piece of advice might be awkward to do on purpose, but just being honest, one of the things that has made it the easiest for me to have these conversations about gender and sexuality with my kids is just having LGBT people in our life. My kids know about non-binary pronouns because we have people who use them in our house, and my kids just know how to say they, them because they have practiced on real people, and they primarily know those real people for how fun they are and what kind of good jokes they make and how they play with the kids. My kids know about gender transition because somebody in my family did it, and we talked about the name change, and we talked about all the things that weren't going to change. My kids know about same-sex relationships because a couple I'm close with has a kid their age. It's not particularly hard to explain these things when you can just point to a person that they already know and like and say, like them. And, okay, well and good, but I don't have any LGBT friends, what am I supposed to do? Maybe read a book together that has an LGBT character, or watch a show together, like Steven Universe, or Owl House, or She-Ra and the Princesses of Power. You can still have somebody positive to point to and say, like that person. Okay, so for my third tip, let's just get really practical. You've done the anatomy stuff all your kids' life, they know where babies come from, things are normal, you're at home, you're not in public, nobody who's going to be offended by anything is around, and your kid comes up to you and says, "Mom, what's..." What are you gonna do? There are a lot of potentially right ways to handle this. I like to start with, "That's a really good question. I'm really glad that you asked me." Some kids go around just saying these things to their friends without knowing what they mean, and they can get in really big trouble. It's really cool that you trust me. Or, be less of a dork about it, that's fine. The second thing I like to say is, "Well, what do you know so far?" Because that can give you a lot of guidance as to how much detail you need to go into. You have a lot more freedom to use your own judgment of, what's kid appropriate for their age level. But if some other kid at school was filling their ear with, "No, yes," then you need to be able to deal with that. So start by having them tell you what they think they know, and go from there. This is another area where you can prepare ahead of time and say, okay, if they ask me about this topic, what am I going to say? And it's also okay to say, "I want to give you a good answer to this question. Let me think about how to explain." You can just say that, and kids will be like, "Oh, okay." It's fine. Now, if anything really weird came out when you asked them what they know about it already, you can circle back at the end and say, "Just out of curiosity, where did you hear about it?" And it might be necessary to say, "You're not in trouble, I'm just wondering," but you need to stick to that and not actually get them in trouble. Even if there's something that you need to change about who they're hanging out with or what kind of TV they're watching, you really want to maintain the relationship where your kid can bring you questions. Now, my fourth and I think final piece of advice here is just have some perspective. When it comes to having the talk, or better yet, having all the little talks, I think we freak out way too much about this. Kids understand things. I say this as a former kid and as a parent. There are way harder things to talk to your kids about. Grandparents die. Mr. Rogers had a whole episode about divorce. Friends move away. Parents get arrested. Teachers get breast cancer. Schools have mass shooting drills. Schools have actual mass shootings. How am I supposed to explain that to my child? There is nothing scary about the birds and the bees, or the bees and the bees, or the bee birds. All of that is just the world functioning normally. It will not hurt your children to know things. When you get right down to it, the answer to why are those two men holding hands is because they want to. It's not complicated unless we make it complicated. And we're back. I got kids. Now, I want to talk about one more thing, which I've alluded to a few times in the video. It's weird to talk about because it's making something that is not about me, about me. The best reason to support LGBTQIA2+ people is because they deserve it. The second best reason to support them is because you deserve it. I had a funny experience a couple of years back where I experienced gender euphoria for the first time. And it was when I was watching a particularly just beautiful and funny trans woman talk. And I thought to myself, am I bisexual? What's happening? Why? What is this delight and joy that's filling my heart? And later in this particular woman's presentation, she laughed spontaneously and her voice dropped down into a masculine register. And my heart did this thing and I was like, oh, that's what attraction is. Okay, there is a difference. When my hindbrain reads this person as masculine, they're attractive. But the thing that's happening when I'm reading them as feminine is something else. And I took some time thinking about it over the next few weeks and realizing that a lot of my favorite people are trans women. And thinking, what is it that draws me to this demographic so much? And it's weird to even say that about a group of people, right? That people aren't a monolith. Some trans women are stinkers. I'm just saying, the ones I know are very cool. There is something that, when I look at a trans woman that I have never met before, something in me goes, that's a friend. I've come up with a theory, and here it is. I am neurodivergent. I have at least ADHD, kind of don't know what's going on. It's fine. Like, I'm good. I have coping skills for whatever my deal is. But when I was young, I had a really hard time getting along with groups of girls. I still have a hard time getting along with groups of women. There is some kind of social rule about how to have those conversations that I don't understand. And that's not to say there's something wrong with girls and women any more than there's stuff wrong with everybody. But I seem to have some kind of social learning disability. I have a hard time talking to multiple people at once. I have a tendency to info dump, and I have kind of unusual interests. So as a teenager, I just was friends with a lot of guys. They didn't know the girl rules either, so they didn't care, and they didn't expect me to know the guy rules, so we just kind of vibed. I was just sort of myself. I wasn't one of the guys because I wasn't a tomboy. I felt really strongly about my own femininity, but I sought out social situations where I was the only expert on what femininity meant, and I could define it for myself. And so I would have very long hair and wear skirts, and I would also code and climb trees and play video games, and what I'm saying is not weird. Lots of girls do all of that kind of stuff. Lots of women do all of that kind of stuff. The point I'm trying to make is I kind of felt like I was bad at girling, and then one day I wake up and I'm watching this particular person talk, and a feeling of recognition comes to me because here is another, definitely a woman, who has created her own version of femininity, who has chosen the good parts and left out the parts that are artificial and oppressive. I really admire the project of inventing your own femininity and embracing it and enjoying it in this, like, I'm claiming this for myself kind of a way. It didn't come naturally. I had to make my own. Hello from the editing room, which is the same place as the filming room. I wanted to throw in a little bit here, giving some love to butch trans women, tomboy trans women. I'm talking mostly about femme stuff, but that's just because I'm talking mostly about myself. I also want to give some love to trans masculine people who are a big part of my life, and non-binary people who are a big part of my life. I love you all. And this phenomenon that I'm describing of feeling like empowered by the existence of trans women that have kind of the same aesthetic that I do, is very much a phenomenon that happens for other people besides me. For example, I have had friends talk to me about how they see butch lesbians as a really positive example of masculinity. So, you're doing great. All of you are making the world better, except for the ones who are stinkers. And I think it's so beautiful, and I'm so glad that I live in a world where not everybody is cisgender. I know that there are some trans people who wish that they had just been born as the gender that they want to be. But I know other trans people who are really glad that they had to transition to become themselves, who really value the experience that they had. And, you know, some of them had a pretty easy and accepting experience of that, and most of them did not have a very easy and accepting experience of that. But there is still this kind of just joy of being able to create yourself. And I feel really lucky to have had that in my life. If you feel anxious about these topics or unsure, all of that is completely okay. You are allowed to feel however you feel. And I encourage you to go out and learn more, and learn it from people who are part of the community and who like the community. Even if that's not your exclusive source, it's not a source that you can leave out. It's not fair. You need to have somebody in your life who is trans, who you love, even if it's parasocially, even if it's somebody on the internet who will never know you exist. Because not having any trans people in your life is no way to live. When it comes to parenting, let me tell you something. It is so much harder and more embarrassing to explain transphobia than it is to explain gender identity.